Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Assisi conference. I would like to orient you for just a moment before moving on to Dr. Conforti and then Muriel McMahon and our speaker, Jonathan Pageau, this morning. For your listening pleasure, if you're having any problems at all with the technology or the sound is not quite right, please know that it's probably on your end and that what you might want to do if you're having those problems is to use earphones. If not, the recording will be going out early in the week. The recording will have high quality sound. Any questions or anything, please put on the chat bar. I'll be monitoring the chat bar. And if you have any questions, please just put it out there. And with that, I want to welcome you and welcome the director and founder, Dr. Michael Conforti.
Welcome, everybody. And it's a pure joy to have this program put together, the inaugural event in 3 languages, and Italian's coming next. So it's finding a way to speak about meaningful issues to people from many different walks of life. And from the beginning, Assisi has been a truly transdisciplinary program. And just so you know, we began probably the first 11 years in Assisi, Italy, doing a lot of work in the new sciences, from systems theory, particle physics, and people said, why, bring the arts in. And I had a sense in the beginning, we'll get to the arts, we'll get to this other work, it's essential, but there was something about the need to understand the working of fields. And we began to understand from the start that in the same way we have fields in the outer world, gravitational, electromagnetic, there are fields in the psyche, in the individual and collective. And we've been studying this for years, and it's been a tremendous journey. And here we are today. Where are we? August 23rd. We have people from 20 different countries on the call. Naja's here, originally from Iran, now living in Chypre, in Cyprus. We have Medellin, we have Venezuela, we have many, many parts of the world. The Bronx, we get Canada. And there's something very special. I mean, it's kind of silly even saying it that way, but when you have people coming together to share an experience. And I don't know if you remember this, but the original meaning of the word Eranos, many of you know about the Eranos conferences that Jung and many of the greats were part of for many years. It was to bring something of value to the table. And I see this as another experience of that. Eranos had its day, but as an archetype, it lives. And the CC really has picked up the thread of that. And one of the greatest compliments we've ever received, I say we as a community, was from a wonderful man named Mario Jacobi. Many of you remember Mario. He passed away about 4 years ago. And he said, Michael, we're having wine in Assisi overlooking the valley and talking about the conference. And he said, this is the closest I've ever seen to what they did at Eranos, where you're really looking at the presence of psyche in the world. And I took it to heart. So with that, I want to welcome everybody and to say that what this weekend is about, it's the expression of psyche in the material world, and specifically, and this is going to be part of the talk that we're going to hear today, it's seeing how psyche gets manifested in the events within and around us. And we put together, I feel, a fabulous faculty. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Muriel McMahon, a Jungian analyst and director of studies at the Institute. She's also now running our certificate program in the study of archetypal patterns and fairy tales. And she's going to introduce our guest speaker for today. Muriel, welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much, Sylvia, and to all of you, welcome back. So it is a profound pleasure for me to introduce to you our speaker today, Jonathan Pageau. I would like this introduction to extend a bit beyond the bio that was published in the symposium program, because you can read that. But without a doubt, Jonathan is an accomplished and renowned icon carver and liturgical artist. He co-founded the Orthodox Arts Journal with building designer Andrew Gold and gives week-long carving seminars several times a year. Jonathan is also an expert on traditional symbolism, and you're going to hear about that today. Each year, he gives conferences all over North America on the relevancy of symbolism today. His work on symbolism has been featured in publications like Newsweek and The Federalist. He hosts a YouTube channel with over 80,000 subscribers and millions of views. He has recently launched a new publishing platform featuring several authors dealing with symbolic structures on his website, thesymbolicworld.com. So please check that out. But here's where I'd like to focus our attention this morning by way of my introduction. I met Jonathan at one of his week-long icon carving seminars in Connecticut. I signed up on an impulse and I immediately regretted it because I had no experience in carving. But I contacted Jonathan saying, I'm in over my head. I think I should withdraw. What do you think? And Jonathan was just so compassionate, such a good teacher. He guided my purchase of equipment and he assured me that I would be fine. And I was. I learned so much that week. One of the things I learned in carving an icon from brass wood is to start with the frame. Those of you who have been around Assisi and are aware of the profound work of Dr. Robert Langs and its extension into the clinical work of Dr. Conforti, your ears attuned to the word frame. A frame defines the inside and the outside and the interactive field between. Jonathan taught me to begin with the frame, and he said the deeper one goes in this initial stage, the more space there is for the image to emerge. Jonathan's work in carving and liturgical art and his work in cultural commentary and pattern articulation emerges from such a deep frame. The deepest frame there is, the frame of narrative. Well-constructed, eternal narrative. The church fathers, indigenous art making, deep scholarship, and an infectious curiosity inform and deepen the translations that Jonathan will offer us. Jonathan Pageau, the icon carver, taught me that the icon is a portal into the mystical mysteries, and that's half the story. The other half is how this encounter informs your living. I commuted to work with Jonathan for 2 years. Listening to his Symbolic World podcast as I drove, I discovered that the same skill with which he opens the wood or the stone, he also opens us to what is emerging in our culture. So please welcome Jonathan Pageau, my teacher, my favorite artist, and a man of engaging mind, contagious laugh, and an open heart as he takes us into the ecstasy and madness of 2020. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you so much for that introduction. That was a little overwhelming. And so we're going to, first of all, I really am grateful for this opportunity. I feel like I am in a different place than I usually am when I'm talking about symbolism, which is I usually try to speak in a way that is addressing neophytes and the general public. And therefore I always try to adapt my language to the most basic way of speaking. And so I'm excited and a little terrified to now be surrounded by symbolists in your own way. And so hopefully we'll be able to explore some ideas. We're going to talk about what's happening in culture this year with COVID and the explosion of protests and disorder especially in America. And so you understand that I am going to be walking a razor's edge and also walking straight into a minefield. And so I will implore your understanding and your generosity in my approach. And hopefully there'll be room for a lot of questions. Hopefully I won't say anything that will be too offensive to anybody. That's not what I want to do, but I want to help people see as much as possible the pattern of what is happening. All right, and so let me start. So a few years ago, if I had shown you the image of thousands of people kneeling with masks next to defaced and toppled statues, you would have thought you were watching scenes from a dystopian movie. If I would have shown you images of New York boarded up, of people behind plexiglass shields, of rioters burning down buildings, strange things like public foot washing rituals, or a naked woman spreading her legs facing a row of riot police, would you have believed it? If in 2010, for example, I would have told you that Donald Trump could be president, if I would have told you that Donald Trump could be president, or that someone like Kanye West, who was married to a Kardashian, would run for president and both would be aligned with Republicans, I don't think you would have believed me. And so the world, at least the Western world, seems to have gone into a carnival of madness and ecstasy and the confusion of the extremes. The question is, what is happening? Why do the 2020 protests look so religious in their tone? Why do people wearing masks and squirting hand sanitizers on their hands, why does that remind me of my grandmother going to a Catholic church 60 years ago, wearing a veil and putting holy water on herself? What are the patterns being played out? What we're experiencing is the tail end of a process that started several centuries ago. In the progressive ideals of utopia, the West believed in the world where science could break us through the dark tyranny of religion. It all started with the Enlightenment. And in the Enlightenment, they believed that secular ideas could free us from the slavery of superstition. The West progressively evacuated the rituals, the beliefs, the hierarchies of meaning, and the narrative which underlie our civilization. The utopian dream of peace, freedom, and progress, both moral and technical. Yet the desire to remove these patterns, sorry, I'll come back to this. And the desire to remove these patterns, the secular gurus seem to ignore the reasons for the religious patterns that underlied our civilization. They never understood the stabilizing of identities which these religious patterns offered us. David Hume famously said, if we take in our hand any volume of divinity school or metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flame, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. People like Hume, writing on the fumes of a religious civilization, didn't understand the inevitability of these patterns of being, patterns of communion and exclusion, of hierarchy and attention. They did not seem to perceive how what we call religious structures, though sometimes prone to abuse, were nonetheless a mediator and an integration tool for very deep instincts. When you remove the valves set for certain desires, a structured flow for the experience and participation in our identities and in the eclipsing of our identities, those suppressed forces will build up until there is an explosion. Identity and other, inside and outside, beginning and ending, coherence and completeness, all these terms, it turns out, are mediated by myth, by ritual, and by participation. So what we're seeing right now is we're seeing religious patterns returning in a frenetic way, unmediated and raw. And of course, this happened 100 years ago. And we got the 100 million deaths that was predicted by Dostoevsky and the devils. But we haven't dealt with the issues that were brought about in the early 20th century. We haven't dealt with them. And so although they were sent into a loop after the sacrifice of millions of people, we're now seeing those patterns appear once again. So it now seems that in the final evacuation of what was left of the Western tradition, as we replace what is left of the imperfectly embodied hierarchies of the medieval synthesis with the progress of competing utopias, we've unleashed the extremes of identity once more. On the one hand, Dionysus, it seems, is back in town. The mad Bacchae are roaming the mountain. We see the sparagmos of King Pentheus is underway. But at the same time, and this is the inevitability of unmediated extremes, as Dionysus kicks off his destructive orgy, the heaven god Uranos is pushing down on the earth Gaia. As we talk about things like contact tracing, biometric tracking, mask and social distancing, with the GPS, with voice recognition, big data, and the promise of 5G internet, which will suffuse everything with connection, we notice that order and control is becoming total. Uranos is pressing down, and his children can't breathe. The paradox is making us mad. Since the end of World War II, the virus, the exception, the challenge to order had become the state of discourse in art, in popular culture, and politics. From avant-garde movements to rock and roll, to the left-leaning cultural elites. We need to understand that in order to have a proper vision of the insanity which we're facing right now. We must understand to what extent infection, hybridity, and virality had been not only a tool, but the very pattern used by postmodern theorists to affect society. Jacques Derrida has said, quote, "All I have done is dominated by the thought of a virus, what could be called parasitology or virology. The virus is in part a parasite that destroys, that introduces disorder into communication. Even from the biological standpoint, this is what happens with a virus. It derails a mechanism of communicational type, its coding and decoding. On the other hand, it is something that is neither living nor non-living. The virus is not a microbe. And if you allow for these two threads, that is, of a parasite, which disrupts destination from the communicative point of view, disrupting writing, inscription, and the coding and decoding of inscription, and which, on the other hand, is neither alive nor dead, you have the matrix of all that I have done since I began writing." And this is not just true of Jacques Derrida. This is true of most postmodern activism. The use of the image of virality is an integral part of the system to break down the pervasive order. We can see this not just in general postmodernism, we can see it in queer theory. And I want to quote you just from a run-of-the-mill paper on queer theory. Queer theory, quote, "Queer theory also recasts the meanings of viral and hybrid identities. The health sciences privilege essential notions of human beings and populations, encumbering them with objectivity and empirically determined values, belief, attitudes, risks, and social trajectories. HIV calls into question the centrality of this certainty through contesting binaries and continually exposing social inequities. Whereas medicine pathologizes hybridity as the subjectivity of contagion, one that creates instability around human identity, queer subjectivity tries to interfere in the reciprocal constitutions between the naturalized body and the normative social order enabled by medical discourse. Queer theory looks to dislodge this concordance through insistent adoption of viral processes of rapid transformation, mutation, and momentary identity, processes against which the normative subject wishes to defend itself. On one level, the end game of queer theory would be to use these viral processes as a way to infect and hence transform the body politic. Strategies of dislocation and disruption have been the rule since the end of World War II, at least. And in order to fully understand the scope of the total pattern and how terrifying it is, we need to not shy away from seeing such strategies in direct contrast and opposition to the pre-World War II fascistic tendency of seeing marginal identities as viruses to be expunged. Adolf Hitler was fond of images of disease, plague, and infection as metaphors for problems within the, quote, body politic. If you notice, that's a term that was also used by the queer theorists quoted above. If in postmodern theory, viral strategies of hybridity, mutation, and disruption coming from the margins were the tools to bring about change, in Hitler's vision, it is precisely because of this strategy that the marginal identities, acting as disrupting agents, had to be purged from the body. In 2020, the juxtaposition of a viral pandemic with a series of protests against systemic racism might seem arbitrary and narratively unrelated. That is, it might seem like they're not proceeding from the same deep cause. But upon investigation, and for those attentive to the patterns of existence, we see that they are in fact related. They're related to each other in terms of the current zeitgeist and the current narrative strain. COVID and the George Floyd protests in conjunction seem to have brought the questions of identity and what cognitive psychologist John Vervaeke has termed the meaning crisis into a kind of apex. It has inscribed this crisis of meaning into our bodies. It has disrupted all our social interactions, framed the way we see authority, society, and our personal relationships, and not in just one direction. Opposites and extremes are jutting up against each other in their patterns. They're crossing, they're smashing into one another. They're appearing on both sides of the culture war simultaneously. And so, though each side seems to be opposing each other, they are in fact manifestation of the extremes, and they're supported by the same underlying pattern. So I want to take you on a little trip that is going to be slightly disturbing for you, but hopefully it would also be helpful to see the madness of this moment. All right, here we go. Build a wall. but I can't breathe. I'm overwhelmed by a foreign body. I need to segregate. I need to separate. But I need diversity. I need to be open. We have to open. No borders. But the foreign body must be eradicated. Defund the police. Destabilize the hierarchy. Enforce openness. Punish those who are not segregating from each other. But police power is white power. I can't breathe. Why can't I breathe? Can you see the pattern? The pattern lays hidden under its dual manifestation. The political enemies are two heads of the same serpent. The problem which is manifesting itself is the ontological problem, which has plagued us from the beginning. It is the very query of existence ramped up on steroids. How do things exist? And we've come to the end of the Enlightenment possibility. Science cannot give us an answer. In this question, Hume's quest for quantity and facts is useless. And we saw it all through COVID. Nobody even agrees on the facts anymore. It's always easier to see when we see that it's always our enemies that don't agree with the facts. We have the facts on our side, right? A description of the weight and energy of this or that particle cannot account for why and how Canada or Seattle or New York are things that exist. Or better yet, that things like friends, strangers, enemies, neighbors are all categories I experience as existing, and not just existing, but the categories that are of prime importance to humanity, far more important than the weight of a proton or the density of some distant black hole. That's where we reach the end of what the Enlightenment could offer us. So the question is, how do things exist? It's the basic pattern of everything. How is it possible for things to be both made of parts and also be one at the same time? How can many things exist and all those many things have parts and coexist somehow? How do we do it? How do things distinguish themselves from each other? Right? How can there be both unity and multiplicity, consistency and change? If change and death are inevitable, how much of it should we let in? And how much should we hold at the door? And so in our current crisis, the ancient question is the same one that has been plaguing humanity forever. We still have Parmenides and Heraclides facing each other, locked in a deadly duel for which our very civilization hangs in the balance. How do we exist together? And so in this moment of crisis, we might delude ourselves in looking for a wise person. We might think that if only we had our own version of Socrates, maybe we could see through the fog that the pre-Socratics offered us. But no, just like Athens of the 5th century BC, which was also experiencing a crisis very similar to the one we're facing now, it would probably be in the killing of that annoying fool and bothersome Socrates, which would help us reunite as a society. Well, if we can't kill him, at least maybe cancel him. Is it not said that on the day Christ was killed, Pilate and Herod became friends? So if we're not careful, we might not notice that there's part of that which is being promised to us now. And of course, I'm definitely not comparing this man to Socrates or Christ in any possible way, but rather as a disruptive character. We're told that we could only unite against that horrible fool and bothersome orange man if we could all cast all our sins, all our rage, all our disdain on the wrestling villain. And he is a wrestling villain, by the way, very much so. If we could just unite against this one evil orange man, then we would find unity once again. And we would find it in that very act of scapegoat exclusion. And it could work. It's worked in the past, but it also might be too late at this point. So what I want to do is I want to look at the elements of 2020. And hopefully it can understand why things appear the way they do. The events that are turning around us, they're religious, they're a ritual, a wild ritual that is somehow out of control, but they are unfolding like a ritual. So I want to look at the elements together and we can try to make sense of what's been going on. But a good way to understand what is happening first, before I go through the details, is to maybe remind ourselves of some traditional cosmic images. Instead of this radical inside and outside that seems to want to take shape, it might be best to imagine the world as a wheel. And of course, this is a universal image, and it links the microcosm and the macrocosm together. It has been expressed in it has been expressed in many, many cultures, in many times. I will give you a small quote from Saint Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, an Orthodox ascetic and mystic, who says, "We must therefore keep in mind that as the center of a wagon wheel has a certain number of spokes going out to the circumference of the circle and returning to the center where they meet, so also is the heart of man like a center where all the senses, all the powers of the body, and all the activities of the souls are united." And here this analogy of the body politic is at play, for the entire cosmos and horizon of human experience can be expressed in the same way as a wheel. The center is the essence, the hidden identity, the name. It is the place where multiplicities find their unity. And just like a wheel, the invisible center holds no space in the actual wheel. It is a virtual point which holds everything together. The center is without measure. It is formed invisibly by the union of the spokes. The spokes are indefinite in number. They are the multiplicity of aspects which constitute a being. For a country, it is the citizens, smaller entities like provinces, cities, streets, houses, etc., the geographic elements, but also the more abstract elements like laws, constitution, common memory, common history. The center is marked in time by a founding, putting down a flag, naming a place, and also darker aspects like conquering former inhabitants. So both in time and its natural expression and manifestation, a being has the tendency of moving away from the primordial center and expressing its particularities more and more. Now, there are two forces at play. There's a centrifugal force and a centripetal force. We can express it in several ways. As I'm with Jungians, you might appreciate the alchemical formulation of coagula and solve, the coming and fusing of elements to form a being, and the dissolution of elements back into their constitutive parts. These are in attention. It has been expressed in Christianity and Judaism as the right hand, the left hand, the hand which gathers in the wheat or the sheep, and the hand that burns off the chaff or casts away the goats. Right? In its balanced form, it's like a pattern of breathing. It's the pattern of heartbeat. The Sufi poet Rumi explains it beautifully by saying, it's probably a quote you've all heard before, your hand opens and closes, opens and closes. If it were always a fist or always a stretched hand, you would be paralyzed. Your deepest presence is in the very small contracting and expanding, the two as beautifully balanced and coordinated as bird wings. Yet as we get farther from the center, the fears formulated, or let's say hidden in Rumi's formulation, are expressed. The two forces become stronger and stronger as the spokes get farther away. They naturally separate from each other. And in order to maintain coherence, the center must exude more pressure to maintain the unity, in more pressure of rotation, right, to maintain the unity so that the spokes and the rim remember the center. And as we reach further and further, nearing the rim and the end of the wheel, the two tendencies, the unifying principle and the dividing principle, can appear as opposites, especially as the spokes see the rim as a better expression of where they're going. And here at the end of a world, the two forces can express themselves as a battle for order versus freedom, meaning versus exploration, identity versus variety. The further we are from the center of the wheel, the faster it goes as well. The spinning appears as a series of flips, of inversions and strange tumblings, which is why you can see a person wanting to open America in one sense, but simultaneously wanting to close the borders in another. And that one person wants you to isolate yourself totally from everybody else with masks and shields and barriers, while simultaneously advocating for the viral effect of marginal identities. So it is in this moment of tumbling and turning and spinning and inversions that we find the fool, the clown, the madness, the carnival on the edge of the city. And as the wheel becomes wobbly, strange things start to happen. It becomes impossible to know what is true. Our desires are out of control. But religious forms or ancient forms of social mediation were meant to participate and to manifest for us the entirety of the wheel, not just the center, not just the spokes, not just the rim, but show the relationship of all the parts to the whole and the whole to all the parts. And that is why many rituals in traditional societies act as stabilizing elements for these two tendencies, for the coagula solve elements. So if we compare the events of 2020 to a normal liturgical form, I'm going to try to compare it to, I'm mostly familiar with Christianity, so I will be comparing it a little more to a church. Hopefully I can also find a few examples from other traditions, but can help us see what we're going through is a manifestation of the same patterns of what religion was meant to mediate, but it's happening in an extreme manner. Now, disease is in a certain way the ultimate test of identity. It is very much a test of identity. And we could see it happen before our very eyes, because the question immediately became, where do we put the walls? So it no longer was a question of whether or not there should be walls. It was a question of where we should put the walls. Should we put the walls around countries? Should we put the walls around, regions, cities? And what ended up happening is we ended up creating walls at every possible level, down as close as possible to the individual, as close as possible to separating individuals from each other. This is what happened. And so we can't imagine that something else could have happened, but we could imagine other possibilities, which would have been to identify the vulnerable and put walls around the vulnerable. We did the opposite. We separated everybody from each other, and the vulnerable ended up dying in their, in their homes, in the homes which are there to protect elderly people. But this is what happened. And it ended up acting very much like a form of fasting. And it's strange because it also happened during Lent, which is just very particular. Fasting and Lent, for example, is a way to break down our activity, to reduce activity, and to hold back our passions, let's say. And so in society, we have all these manners in which we express our communion, we express our coming together, our celebration, the things we celebrate that make us feel like we are connected to each other. We have different clubs, we have churches, synagogues, mosques, different communities, we have families, and we also have sports. And sports is actually a pretty big deal. The fact that the COVID took sports away from people I think is a bigger deal than what you might think at the outset, because there's a type of person which really, really needs to identify with something. There's a type of personality which has to identify with a group, has to have a clear enemy, and has to have a way to vent that desire to defeat the enemy. And sports is actually a good way to channel that and to avoid the worst aspects of that pattern. But then that was also taken away, and so people became isolated and alone in their homes, shut off from society, shut off from everybody else. And then something happened. And the thing that happened, it could have been something else, it could have been other things, but we watched someone get killed. Now, I have to ask you, when's the last time you actually watched someone get killed? I mean, not in a movie, not in a TV show, but an actual person slowly dying in front of you. We don't watch that. Those images are taken away from us. But for some reason, this image of a man being tortured for a very long time became not only accessible, but watched by pretty much everybody. And what happened is a catharsis, a religious catharsis. A very classic catharsis, like Aristotle told us about catharsis. Because in that moment, watching that person get killed, you were meant to identify with the victim, of course, right? I mean, compassion for a man who was being crushed in the street. But the majority of people were also asked to identify with the killer. And that's really important. It's important for the explosion that followed to understand that those two things had to happen at the same time, that we had to identify with the victim and with the killer. And that is what caused the explosion of catharsis. And what it did is it caused people to run into the streets and commune in the name of this cathartic experience. And it also became a place to celebrate and to express what was seen as the highest value. The value of inclusion, the value of equality, anti-racism. And it's fascinating because if you look at what happened, if you were able, it was hard to keep cool in those moments. It was very difficult because it was extremely aggravating to watch that and then to see it happen. But if you're able to keep cool, you'll notice that everybody agreed. Everybody thought that what happened was horrible on both sides of the political aisle. Even the orange man was horrified by what happened. But nonetheless, those who commune together continue to express a sense that they were a kind of resistance to this hegemonic power which was against them. I mean, and not just people. Like I mean, I don't know if you, but I received emails from every single company, from Nike, from Amazon, from every single corporation, Google, all sent me emails to say that they were in communion on this event. And this is where things get a little out of control. And this is where the pattern of religion starts to express itself, and in a manner that is unmediated, and starts to look more like very ancient pagan practices. Because what we started to see were rituals of contrition. There were crazy images of people willfully being flogged in the street, washing other people's feet, kneeling down, and this ecstatic destruction of property. All of this is part of this cathartic explosion that happened. And the last part, which is the strangest and the most surprising, is the human sacrifice. And when I say human sacrifice, I really want to be careful. I want to be careful because I want us to understand that the human sacrifice which was occurring within the narrative of those doing it. And it in a way doesn't matter objectively what was happening, but within the story that the people were embodying, there was an aspect which was human sacrifice. Because it was the same people who just a week before had said we should not congregate, we should not meet, we should not visit our grandparents, we should not go to church, we should not go to our clubs, we should not go to the mosque. None of these things, you can't go into businesses, as little as possible. Why? Because if you do so, you're killing people. If you congregate, if you commune, you are killing people. And then the very same people, in an act of catharsis, commune in the name of a higher value. And they were willing to accept the consequences. They were willing implicitly, of course, they weren't going out to say we're committing human sacrifice, but within their narrative, human sacrifice was part of what was going on. Because if they said a week before that communion brings death, then in their communion, they knew, or at least implicitly knew, that they were bringing death, or at least possibly bringing death. And so the scary thing, now see, all of these things are there in religious ritual. And I can use Christianity as an example. In Christianity, there is also the notion that we are meant to identify with the victim, that is Christ, and identify with the killer, right? If you look at a church and you look at the priest is the one who breaks the bread in the altar. The priest is the one who, in the Orthodox Church, who actually uses a lance and pierces the bread, and uses a knife and cuts the bread, and sees it as a form of sacrificial act. And so the Christian is meant to identify both with Christ as the victim and with the killer of Christ at the same time. And in a manner, if you follow the scholar René Girard, he presents that as a solution to the problem of scapegoating, a solution to the problem of identity, which is by having the highest thing be both the victim, a moment where both the victim and the killer are joined together in a kind of paradoxal communion, and they engage in a horrific event, which is consuming the flesh of the sacrifice of the God man, then that solves the problem of identity, or it solves the problem of scapegoating. In practice, sadly, that didn't always happen. As if you know anything about the history of Christianity, you'll know that didn't happen. But at least in principle, that is the image of what was going on. But now in this new catharsis and in this new high ideal that we need to sacrifice to, it seems like we don't have the possibility of resolution. It seems like there is no absolution in the relationship. And so because of that, we will see, and we're already seeing, the scapegoating. And scapegoating is going to increase. And right now it is rather pale looking. It's basically cancel culture, where we, as white people, as the representative of the people who have power, the only way to expunge your sin is to on the one hand, self-flagellate, and on the other hand, find someone guiltier than you that you can scapegoat, that you can accuse of being worse than yourself. And so it is not, because it is so chaotic and so broken, the way in which these religious patterns are happening again are creating the same problems that we saw at the beginning of the 20th century. And now we see one side of that, right? Now we see the side in our country, we see the side of diversity, the side of absolute inclusion, the side of absolute equality, the side of the refusal to exclude anybody. The only person you can exclude, it's a kind of meta exclusion. You can scapegoat those that scapegoat. It's kind of meta scapegoating. But just like at the beginning of the 20th century, the pendulum doesn't go just one way. And the other side of those two snakes is staring straight at the first one. And we run a large risk of the pendulum, swinging back to the other side. We often forget that in Weimar Germany, before Hitler was elected, they were on the verge of a communist revolution, that those two things were fighting each other, that these two extremes were facing each other. And it's not obvious to know which side is going to win, even though we only see one side at a time sometimes. Things are flipping very fast. And so it is a scary time in that sense. And so what's the solution? What I've been doing for the past 10 years, maybe a little less, maybe 8 years, has been a strange desire to help people understand the margin. Because one of the problems of the way that things are set up is that there is no margin, no real margin. That is, either we want the margin to take over the center and to be the new rule, or we want the margin to be fully cut off from the body. But the true margin, the normal hierarchy of the wheel, in the normal hierarchy of the wheel, there is a powerful and important place that the margin plays. And so that has been one of the things that I've been doing. I don't want to go into it too much because I guess I've already been speaking for almost an hour, but I've been talking about monsters and talking about veils, talking about a lot about feminine symbolism, this notion of the frame and the edge, and all of these images of the margin, of the side, of the frame, of the container, all of this imagery, I think we need to recover in a healthy way so that we don't get pulled into the extremes. And by seeing the margin properly and the function of the exception, of the strange, of the stranger, of the foreign, all of these categories, which are important, understanding them properly and their function in the whole system, to me seems to be one of the keys in then reappropriating the center also in a healthy manner, and not in a way that will be radical and will cut off all that doesn't fit. And so that is what I wanted to kind of share with you today. And I know it might have been a little bit of a rough road, but hopefully you can see the reason why I wanted to share it, and we're able to perceive a little bit of the pattern and the danger of the extremes as they rear their heads up right now.
Thank you. Muriel or Michael, would you like to respond? I have you, Michael,
Okay.
on screen.
It's Jonathan, it's wonderful scholarship. And, when you could look at world events and try to understand the matrix, the domain out of which it arises, you're doing phenomenal work with that. And I think especially when young and early Jungians turn their attention, a lot of part of their lives, to world events, they were doing what you're doing right now. So I really stand in admiration of how you're approaching this. And I mean it from the bottom of my heart. I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask you that maybe you can expand on.
Sure.
When I really love this idea about in Christianity that maybe it's the transubstantiation, when there's a union, or we're asked to identify with both the victim and the killer. I had never heard or thought about that before. Could you say a little more about it? Because much of what happens in biblical material is we seem to. And Robert Lange wrote about this, one of our founders, that the murder is the one that's been elevated and been totemized, not as much the victim.
Yep.
Now, you're saying something here which is quite radical, I think archetypally really accurate. And I'd like to hear you explain a little more about what about this relationship between the killer and the victim that we're being asked to identify with in the Mass, maybe the symbolism of the Mass and communion.
Yeah. I think that the interesting thing about Christ, and I always try to talk about this, is that the image of Christ is very difficult to see. We have the story, we have the Gospels, but the manner in which Christ spans all manner of archetype at the same time is extremely difficult to encompass in our glare. And so you can see it, because if you look at Christians, you'll see that they tend to always emphasize one aspect of Christ, different denominations or whatever you call it. And so Christ is both the judge, right? He's presented as the great judge, as the final judge of all things, but he's also the judged one. He's also the one who was lifted up and killed on a cross and accepted to become sin for our sake. And so that totality is the promise of Christianity, of being able to span those two extremes and unite them, in the figure of Christ. And in our case, I think that, like you said, we have a tendency to totemize the murderer, the conqueror, right? We see it in images of Caesar, Alexander, all the great leaders, or all the great heroes of history are the conquerors. But there's also a way to fetishize the victim. And this is more the situation in the post-World War II era, And René Girard, who talks about this, is someone you might want to look into if you're interested in that. He talked about that he talked about the kingdom of Antichrist will manifest itself as the perpetuation of victimhood, as the idolizing of the victim, and the search for more and more victims, right? A kind of weird inverted world where victims are made into the top of the hierarchy, right? If you can accumulate the most victimhood, then you become the new head of the hierarchy. And that is also it's also very damaging, right? The balance, I think, is really found in the character of Christ and the manner in which, if you look at even in the story of the martyrs in Christianity, we honor the victim, right? In the story of the martyrs, we honor the victims. Churches are built around the entirety of European geography is based on martyrs. Villages, cities in the Mediterranean exist because someone was killed there, and then a church was built, and around that church, a village was constructed. The martyrs are the seed of the church. They are the source of even the physical geography of the church. But the martyr does not, this is hard to talk about because especially in our situation, but the martyr does not accuse his aggressor. The martyr dies, and in that death, a flower grows out of their death, right? And it's the same with Christ, right? This notion that Christ remained silent, that Christ did not decry Pilate or the Pharisees. In his being crucified, he didn't speak. He didn't contest, and so the way that it's presented, I would say, in the kind of the normal Christian hierarchy, the Christian hierarchy of love, is that those that are above, the judges, the kings, the rulers, their function is to care for those below, right? To care for those below them, rather than dominate them. That's the vision, at least. And that's the difference, you could say, between Christian civilization and other ancient civilizations. Even though, like I said, in practice, it rarely happens that way. But at least the ideal was. But the people, the followers, the people underneath, are also supposed to obey, to follow. And it's a kind of contract that happens between the two, where one loves and the other follows. And that is the image of how Christianity comes together. Now what we have is the opposite, right? We have the opposite of that. We have elites that don't care in any way for us, and we have people on the ground who fight, who demand, who want to topple the structure. And so Christianity, in a way, is a kind of this is something that a lot of people might disagree with. I don't think it's revolutionary. It's not revolutionary in the way that moderns understand revolution. It's a deeper revolution, which accounts for everything. And that's why Christ never spoke against Rome, which is surprising, because Rome was really clamping down on the Jews. Like, it was not pretty. And so it's mysterious to understand why Christ never spoke out against Rome. But I think that in understanding that mystery, maybe that's the key to understanding that.
Thank you very much. So Risa has a question, I see, too.
Yes. So Risa, do you want to just speak the question?
Yes, please. What intrigued me was a statement by Jonathan at the beginning of his talk, where he said that a virus is something that is neither alive nor dead, not living or not not living.
Hmm.
This reminded me of Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah, you're right. That's
Yeah.
Derrida played with the principle of uncertainty within language. That's what he's trying to make Schrodinger's cat start to eat the box.
Well,
like a zombie.
nobody has ever commented about the fact what would have happened if another cat could see into the box before it was opened. In your talk, and what a great many people are saying now, gives the power to the human consciousness. When Schrodinger, or rather whoever imprisoned that poor little cat, when that person observed, opened the box, and looked to see whether the cat was alive or dead, that's the moment that the wave function collapses. And the cat either dies or is still alive. I think what we're observing now, not only in the political realm, but in the realm of climate change, in the realm of the fires that are devouring California, and the political upheaval. What we are seeing, I think, is an expression of testosterone poisoning. In other words, what is being glorified is the masculine for a change. What is glorified is aggression, conquest, total. We're now being asked to pay the bill for thousands of years of masculine domination. I have heard numbers of people refer to the Democratic ticket in the upcoming election as Biden and Kamala.
Oh, got it.
Biden and Harris, and never a woman first and a man later. I think we're paying the bill finally of testosterone domination in our human history. You know, it's called Christianity. It's not called Marianatry. That matters. We are paying the bill for all the testosterone, in my opinion. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you, Risa. There are a couple of questions on the chat. I'm not sure that you can see them, but
Yeah, sure. Do you want me to look at some of the questions over there?
right. Somebody asked to say a bit more about bringing the margin and center back into communication. Somebody wants to know, you use the word de-evolution. And let's see. Also, I'm just giving you some of the things to think about. Okay.
So if someone's, some people are asking for some of the quotes and some of the references, I can maybe send that by email and you can send it to people. No, that's not a problem.
De-revolution, sorry.
De-revolution. Yeah. So in terms of the relationship between the margin and the center, maybe that is something that I can mention, and that it can also maybe address some of the question of rise, and also the question of the masculine and the feminine, because it's really important, and I think that the notion that, for example, that Christianity is called Christianity and not Marianity, I think it's an important question to ask, because one of the things that I have been trying to help or trying to point to people is really the power of the feminine and the power of the question, the power of the frame. And I usually talk about the story of Christ at the wedding of Cana as an example, which is that at the wedding of Cana, Christ is about to enter into his public ministry. Until then, everything he's done has been kind of hidden in secret. And so his mother comes up to him and she says, there's a problem. There's no wine. And then Christ answers, it is not yet my time, which is a strange answer because he's basically answering, I'm not ready to die. And so she says, there's no wine. And he says, I'm not willing to die. So what's going on? The idea is that Mary is opening the door. She is framing his path. She is saying, you're the logos, right? Here's a question. Now answer the question. And the logos doesn't manifest itself without a question. There is no discourse without a frame. And the power of the frame is a secret power. And that's what's so difficult about this question of masculine and feminine. The power of the frame is a secret power. And we can see it now. We can see it today. If anybody pays attention to the news, if anybody pays attention to the battle between CNN and Fox, you will realize that the frame is way more important than the discourse. That the frame of the narrative is primordial, because the information, the way the information fits in that frame is going to completely depend on the frame. And so, but the cost of that power, the cost of the power of the question, and the cost of the power of the frame is the secret. That's the cost. And it's a strange reality, but that's the cost. If you name something, how can I say this? Once the feminine enters into the naming, once the feminine enters into the logos, then it has taken on masculine form. And it has its own, it plays out in its own way. But the frame doesn't go away. You can't make it go away. It'll still be there. It'll still be there. The tohu bohu is still there. It's still under everything. And it's still asking, right? The darkness precedes the light. The space precedes the discourse. The home precedes the family. All of these things are extremely powerful. And one of the things we have seen, it's true, in the modern world, has been a disparaging of that. We have actually seen no value in that. We've only seen value in the masculine. We've only attributed value to masculine. So much that we have told women that the only value they can have is if they become like men. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. I think the feminine is there. The imagery, and I want to be careful, because obviously a woman is not just feminine and a man is not just masculine. It's very important to understand that the world is fractal, and each person contains within them also the duality of masculine and feminine. That's true. But there's also a way in which, as male and female, we play certain roles in society. But we really have diminished the value of the private, the value of the feminine. And so I think that it's something that on the contrary needs to be elevated and venerated. So yeah.
Any other comments or questions? Yes.
Jonathan, where
Yeah.
I have been impressed for years around your mandate or your interest to really establish what I'm going to call the archetype of the margin. That there is a role and an energy and an imperative, proclivities and dominance, that if we try to take the marginal and bring it into the center, we do damage to both. And I think that, you know, as I was listening to this very provocative, painful, and powerful presentation, you know, as we're getting toward the end of it, I'm thinking, and where's the hope? And where's the hope? Please let there be some hope, be some optimism. And I think it's in where you are planting the flag, and to say that we need to appreciate and understand that there will always be the stranger, the foreigner, the grotesque, the monster, and how do we somehow encounter that? And I remember a presentation you gave one time on the structure of the Gothic cathedral, where the very structure speaks to how we meet the stranger. And so, I mean, I think you're circumambulating that in such a powerful way. And, you know, maybe that's where I feel the identity in the residence, that as a Jungian analyst, you know, as a depth psychologist, we're on the margin. We will never be mainstream. And when we try to go mainstream, we do damage to what our mandate is. So,
Right.
so I thank you so much.
And it's important, and especially if you of the Jungian analyst, the whole question of dreams is important in the sense of the margin, in the sense of the time of this in-between space, right? The time of this strange moment between life and death that we go to in sleep. And there really is, like in scripture, there are some amazing imperatives to preserve the margin. People don't see them because they don't sometimes know how to read scripture, especially the law, they don't know how to read. But there are some amazing imperatives to, for example, have a fringe on the vestment of clothing, where clothing needs to have a fringe. And you see that in many cultures. For example, in rug making, when you look at Persian rugs, they always have a fringe, and that fringe has a cosmic structure. It's not just there for decoration. It's there to preserve the wild on the edge of reality, to also have that as part of the world. You know, you see, for example, the idea that you shouldn't reap the corners of your fields in scripture, and that those corners should be left to the foreigner and to the dispossessed. That is exactly that need to leave some buffers, leave the wild in the margin for things to breathe, for the breathing to happen. Because if you close off the system, then you die. You know, it's like you die if you close off the system. Perfect systems die. You need to leave a buffer on the edge. And those buffers have all kinds of forms. Like they talk about veils, we talk about monsters, talk about cherubs, hybrid creatures. All of this stuff is what is on the margins. So it's a whole subject that definitely I'm interested in. I don't want to go into too much, or else I'll just take you all afternoon.
Might not be such a bad thing, but we do have a very lovely following in the afternoon.
I'll be happy to come back to talk to your institute about monsters. It's my favorite subject. So.
You know, one thing I'd like to add in terms of the discussion about religion and theological imagery, clearly Jung, von Franz, and many of the greats, Freud to some extent, they looked at religious imagery and iconography to understand something about psyche. And I say this for some people that are new to the community, Jonathan, that while religion and spirituality is a profound domain in and of itself, it's also one of the richest domains to understand archetypal symbolism. Because what we see in the images, from transubstantiation to all of the different images you spoke about today, you're seeing a manifestation of psyche. And one of the ways that it's moved people from the beginning of time. I mean, look, Bible is probably one of the greatest selling books of all times. The movies, and we know that everybody, whatever side you come on, you're affected by religion. Mm. And it's because it captures. I mean, aside from the issue of transcendence that goes hand in hand with genuine spiritual experience, it seems to just capture so much of the contours of what lives in the life of the psyche. So through the images of, as Dr. Kaufman talked about, the feminine, the archetype of the feminine, the archetype of the masculine, the archetype of aggression, the archetype of submission, the powerful images you presented of kneeling. I mean, my God, when we then ask the question, which is very much of what I think your work is about as a symbolist, and also with the Assisi community, is asking, what are we doing when one kneels, when there's an act of supplication? What does one do when you make an offering? What does one do when we're involved in scapegoating? And so I'm really quite taken by the way you've approached this. And I do want to make this, again, comment for the community, that whether the speakers speak about religion, speak about politics, yes, there's some direct references to those issues, to the politics. I mean, we know the world is in some rough shape today, really. Okay. And trying to understand why, what's manifested. I think that the Kaufman's comment's a good one, that maybe a lot of what's manifested right now is the end of a regime. Hope to God, an end of a regime that's no longer generative. But the point here is all of these stories, all of the biblical tales, Hasidic tales, whatever they might be, the tales of psychic life being told through the imagery and iconography of religious symbolism. So again, for that, I really respect the work you're doing. And Muriel, thank you so much for bringing Jonathan to the CC table for this. So
it was a lot of fun. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, hope you come back.
Definitely.
Okay.
So to end this beginning of our day here, we'll end in another minute or so, and just remind everyone that you will get a recording of this absolutely wonderful presentation, and the caliber of the questions, the caliber of the engagement is amazing. We're sorry that we can't get to everyone, but clearly Jonathan will be invited back again, and we invite you to return in half an hour to hear the graduate Bonnie Pfeiffer present her presentation, and that will be exciting. And like always, I think there's going to be synchronicities in what we're going to be hearing today. So I know that on behalf of all of us, Jonathan, and I don't know if you saw all of the appreciation, I hope that you got to see how much your talk really moved people. See you all in about half an hour. Stretch.
Yes. Do we use the same link to come back?
Yes, everyone, the same link, and you will get this recording, and Jonathan will make available the quotes, or at least the references, and they will go out. So take a break, have some coffee, whatever time zone you're in, do whatever is appropriate, and we'll see you in half an hour.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Nice to meet you. Bye-bye.